Welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. I'm your host, Rafe Kelley. At Evolve, Move, Play, our aim is to help you cultivate a more meaningful life and a more heroic self by reconnecting deeply to movement, mindfulness, nature, and community practices. This podcast was created to bring the best and brightest minds in all of these subjects together to better understand how we can create an empowering and sustainable ecology of practices for personal growth. If you're interested in being part of this ongoing conversation, the best way you can support us and get involved is by joining our Podcast Plus membership. By joining, you will get backstage access to our live podcast airing once a month, as well as a private question and answer session with me and our guests after the show. On top of that, you'll get access to our thriving online community where you can continue these deeper discussions with people all over the world who are just as passionate and curious about these topics as you. More details about the membership, as well as the link to get signed up, are in the description below. And whether you can join, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so that you can be notified every Monday when our episodes drop. Thanks so much for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. Hey guys, welcome back to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. This week, my guest is Josh Peacock. This is the third in my series of recent talks on the topic of martial arts and martial arts pedagogy and play and ecological dynamics. And Josh is the host of the Combat Learning podcast himself, where he's applying an ecological dynamics approach or a constraint-led approach to understanding martial arts pedagogy. He's also been a Taekwondo instructor and will be opening his own Taekwondo school soon. And he has trained in many other martial arts as well. So he's particularly focused on how you can apply these constraint-led approach to Olympic Taekwondo, but he has an interest in combat sports in general and self-defense and everything involved. So I particularly wanted to speak to him after meeting him on Rob Gray's Perception Action podcast, where we had an episode along with Sean Mishka and Scott Seavright, who was on last week, and talked about ecological dynamics in MMA. And one of the things that was really intriguing to me about Josh's perspective was how much it seemed to be informed by a deep historical analysis of the rise of martial arts pedagogy. So I wanted to reach out to him because that's a particular interest of mine. And I have some ideas and things that I've read that have given me an overarching narrative of how these things have happened, but there's some details that I'm not as aware of. And I wanted to just kind of see Josh's perspective on this. And so we go really deep into the history of the martial arts, particularly the Japanese martial arts, but also talking a little bit about the parallel developments in Europe, a little bit about the Chinese martial arts and how they influenced everything in Asia, all the way to the military. And then we talk about the rise of the UFC and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and how that has revolutionized our understanding of martial arts pedagogy, but also how what that revolution is might not be fully understood even in the martial arts community yet, and how an ecological dynamics approach or constraint-led approach can help make what's making the best martial arts even better than they currently are. So it's a super fun conversation. I think you guys will really enjoy it. Without further ado, Josh Peacock. Josh, welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. It's great to have you.
Hey, thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to talk.
Yeah, so we just recently met via Rob Gray's podcast. We had a conversation with Rob and Scott Seavright and Sean Mishka about, the constraints-led approach and ecological dynamics applied to martial arts. So I've been thinking about that from my perspective as kind of a general movement person for a while. And it was really fun for me to meet you and Scott and just realize there are actually people really in the industry who are starting to pick up on this stuff. In particular, I was really intrigued to talk to you because of some of the stuff you started talking about the history of martial arts. Mm-hmm. Like I think I'm becoming aware of some of the stuff that you're aware of, and I have some of the same perceptions of how it probably played out. But it seems like you have a little bit more depth of knowledge there. So I think that'll be super fun to dig into. But before we get into all that stuff, I'd love to have you just kind of introduce yourself to the audience. What is your martial arts background, and how did you get involved in thinking about skill acquisition from a motor learning perspective? And, what are you doing right now within the martial arts?
Yeah. So I started in Taekwondo way back in Winter Park, Florida, many years ago, probably, I think the year 2000. So it's been a little while now. I did that for close to 5 years. before doing a little bit of Shaolin Kung Fu for a while. After I did Shaolin Kung Fu, I did a little bit of American Kempo for about a year. And in Tracy.
Okay.
Do you know the Tracy?
Not as
Kempo?
well. Yeah. But
yeah, so they were some Ed Parker students, very significant Ed Parker students actually.
Okay, cool.
And so they have their style. Their style is the more sweeping. They have all the sets that Ed Parker had, whereas as Ed Parker aged, he got rid of the self-defense sets he used to do. He consolidated them. The Tracys didn't really like that, so they kept everything that he put together. That's the weird internal distinction between the two.
Okay.
I could talk about that forever too. Yeah. But while I was at the American Kempo place, I also did some boxing and some kickboxing and some sport karate, and even a little bit of Filipino. He had all kinds of stuff going on. And then after that, I went back to more Taekwondo training, a lot of self-training really, because I was moving from Florida to Charlotte and kind of in and out of not really having access to places to train. But I got back into, I got into teaching Taekwondo, and I was teaching that for a while. And while I was doing that, I also got into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And that's something that I've continued to do for on and off for the last, I'd say 6 years. So Taekwondo is the big through line. I also have, that karate and a little bit of Kung Fu too. But that is my martial arts background. As far as how I got into skill acquisition from a martial arts perspective, I remember hearing the term motor learning. I don't remember where, probably listening to a podcast or something. So I knew that there was something out there. There was a scientific discipline for learning how to learn movement better and how to teach movement better. So when I was teaching martial arts, the first time I started was way back when I first learned Taekwondo. I was an assistant instructor, I was like a volunteer. Yeah. And so back then I didn't really, I was listening to whatever the training I got from my Taekwondo master and my instructors. But when I started teaching professionally on my own, I started running into these problems with the traditional program. Things didn't work the way I expected them to work. The kids, it was harder to keep the kids' interests than I remember being when I was learning. And so there's a lot of notions that you get from watching Kung Fu movies that were broken for me. Like you're not going to have the kids sitting in for 10 minutes in a horse stance, right? So it's not going to happen. So I started to get interested. How is a better way to approach this?
That's why Miyagi only has one student, right?
Yeah.
The only kid in town will do that.
Yeah. That's exactly the case. Like even before, I should have known before that, because I tried to teach some French. It's not a good idea. Don't try to teach friends that are peers with you. Yeah. But I tried to teach some of them. I was like, this is real martial arts. You're gonna have to sit in the horse stance for 5 minutes and do your punches and whatever, and then we'll do something else. And they weren't interested in that. They were interested in getting the foam sticks and whacking at each other. That should have been a clue to me. Yeah. This should have been a clue to me. But it wasn't. So that's the traditional dogma, how powerful a hold it has on your psyche. And I started looking at just online articles and stuff like that. And at the time, I had just graduated with a bachelor's degree, and I was going to do a master's degree, and I was going to try and pursue being an English writing, a first-year writing instructor. I had it niched down all the way to first-year writing instructor in community college. That was what I was going to do. So I went back for a master's degree in teaching and learning, a master of education, and with a focus in English. And during the course of that, I fell in love with educational psychology and a lot of the issues around teaching and learning. And I ended up doing overall a lot better on those courses than I did on my English courses, just because I was just, I had been writing and stuff like that and reading for most of my life. So that stuff wasn't novel. And I was just much more interested in this educational psychology stuff. So I started to apply that back to what I was doing in teaching. And eventually I just wasn't super satisfied with academic notions of teaching and learning and how that mapped on to teaching martial arts. And so I was just searching until I stumbled upon like Rob Gray's stuff. And I think the very first thing I saw was Trevor Reagan, I think is his name, that with Train Ugly. Mm-hmm. And it's Learner Lab now, but back then it was Train Ugly. And I saw the blocked versus random practice, and that's what got the gears moving. And I not long after that, I found Dr. Rob Gray and was just, my head was spinning. I didn't know what he was talking about in the podcast, but I listened to them each podcast like 3 separate times, not an exaggeration, 3 separate times.
Fair enough.
It began to set in.
Yeah, absolutely. It was so funny to be on Rob's podcast because it was like,
yep,
he's such a source from which I'm pulling the very insights which I'm being asked to offer, right? So that was a pleasure. For me, I started with, I guess I probably talked about this a little bit on that podcast, but it was really an organic evolution where I think parkour inherently is kind of constraints led, and because it's basically self-organized, right? It's this self-organized learning culture that's spread across the world. And so then we try to formalize it and teach it. And we had a lot of success in certain ways. But when I took it from the gym environment to teaching in nature, there was this realization that a lot of what I constructed to instruct in order to sort of help people with skill acquisition was actually not necessary. And that there was something emergent from just the exposure of the athlete to an environment and a task, which started developing the skill. And, like block versus random practice, I think, people in my audience probably are somewhat familiar with these ideas, but it's always useful to kind of review that. But parkour is basically mostly practice randomly. There's not a lot of block practice.
Yeah.
So tell me your understanding of what a blocked versus a random practice is. And then I'm curious how you would see that playing out specifically within the martial arts context.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because the blocked and random practice formats seem to be more conducive to sports where you can practice with clear trials. For example, shooting a free throw, or really even more conducive to that would be baseball, hitting. And so my understanding of blocked practice is that you try to throw the free throw the same way every time and get it into the basket from the same position. That is block practice. And it's also typically paired with massed practice where you do it just lots of repetition. Random practice or randomized practice would be where you shoot from different locations, whether that's from a different angle and from different distances from the hoop. And that would be random practice. And that would also be conducive to maybe shooting with different technique, but I don't know that that's necessarily stipulated in random practice, but random practice would be conducive to that as well, because you're moving from all these different places. So you would be naturally inclined to shoot slightly different every time. For martial arts, how that maps onto martial arts, you have to be careful because you can set up, for example, in jiu-jitsu, you can set up drills that are variable from trial to trial. So you can set up a sequence of just random guard passing drills, but they're not very alive, and the feedback is not recursive, as I like to call it. So you don't, its utility is kind of limited because, like with baseball, that's really how the sport's played. You have the pitcher, you throw it and you hit it, and you go to or you miss and then you try it again. And that's how the sport's actually played. So there's actual ender trials. But in martial arts, you don't do a trial and then, try again. it goes back and forth. There's an exchange that continues to happen until somebody is submitted or knocked out or something like that.
Mhm.
So that's my understanding of the whole thing. I think that probably something more like all these concepts are related to one another. I think martial arts practice would be more like variable practice, or open-ended, or I'm reaching for the word. I know I've probably seen a concept somewhere, a term somewhere that's more accurate, but
Yeah. I mean, I think if you take a classic like karate class or taekwondo class in your case,
yeah,
you have all the students lined up doing, a front punch and a rear punch repeatedly. That's
yeah,
a very good example of a blocked practice.
yeah,
Or, like a classic that you'll get in a lot of jiu-jitsu schools that I've done is at the beginning of the training, you'll do like 10 arm bars, 10 triangle chokes, 10 omoplatas.
yeah, yeah.
That's basically
Right. Yeah. That's how that concept maps onto martial arts.
It's amazing how completely useless that is in my opinion.
Yeah.
Just like if you go and if you're warming up with a blue belt or a brown belt doing arm bars, it's the laziest, least connected, least attended to thing, right? Like there's some mapping of the mechanics of the skill that's happening there, but like they're racing through that to get done to be able to do something that actually is at all engaging and intriguing.
Right.
That'd be an example I give, like, and then like from like my perspective as an ex-gymnast, then parkour, it's like what's fascinating about parkour is how much of it is literally just play behavior. It's like you go out into your environment and you're like, oh, that jump looks interesting. And then you do the jump until it's not interesting, or you do the jump until there's something you can connect to the jump that's interesting, right? It's like, I'm going to do that jump and I'm going to do a flip. And okay, I land the flip and then I'm going to descend down this next thing. And like, I think that the majority of most parkour athletes training is literally just open-ended play. Like it's completely self-organized. You may have some vague goals, like I'm going to work on this type of skills, or I'm going to work on this class of skills, or maybe even these principles, this sort of feeling in my body. But mostly you're just finding challenges and trying them out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think in a martial arts context, like a series of sparring rounds is pretty much random practice.
Right.
It's, obviously there's some structure, but you could be going into that sparring. In every round, you could be exploring a different set of skills, and you're working with a different dynamic environment with the athlete in front of you, if you're working with different athletes.
Yeah.
So
I think that you have to do translation from random practice as it comes out of the research, because in the research, it's more like a practice schedule.
Yeah.
For the session, right? This is the way that the drill or the session schedule is set up. Whereas with martial arts, you have to stay within an exchange instead of, you have rounds, right? And that's how I would translate it. Rounds is your trial difference. But there's more going on that you have to watch out for within martial arts, because if you try to do it exactly clean from the basketball version, you're not going to have enough variability there, enough instability there to actually create those problems and continue to try and find and solve those problems, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure they're that different, because like baseball, at least the batting aspect of baseball is a dyadic interaction where two people have opposing goals and are, they're self-organizing behavior. And the same thing is happening all the time in football and basketball. So, right, I could be working on my shot in a block practice form. I'm going to do 20 free throws, 20 3-pointers from the corner, 20 3-pointers from, from the elbow, right, et cetera. Or I could play 1-on-1, 2-on-2, 3-on-3. Right. We could even like look at something like, we're just going to do post. right? And we're just working on the post. Like that's all basically sparring from from a martial arts perspective. So I think, I wonder how well that's captured in what's talked about as random practice. I'd have to go and look at the literature, but maybe when they're talking about random practice, it's more like how you move through. Like I'm thinking of random practice like a teenager, like out in their backyard, or a kid out in their backyard shooting, right? And they just shoot the ball and they don't have a plan for where they're going to shoot or how often they shoot. They're just like, I feel like doing a 3-pointer now, and now I'm going to go do a layup. Now I'm going to try to dunk, right? Yeah. That's essentially like a random skill practice.
Right.
But then something like actually playing one-on-one, even a constrained game of one-on-one, that's maybe like a continuous variable practice. That might be the way that's represented in the literature.
Yeah, so you brought up the fact is dyadic. I think I'm probably not expressing myself clearly enough on this. My concern is that because you brought up karate, that's actually a good example. So you could have something where you do 1-steps, and every single time you do a 1-step. Now that exchange is discrete, and it's more it's less variable than like a pitch, but it's discrete like a pitch, where there's a clear beginning and an end that happens fairly quickly. And you can do you could set up a random practice, I think, where you do 1-steps from different positions and totally different 1-steps every single trial. But that type of practice would be not as conducive to actual even karate, even points sparring in karate would probably not even be conducive to that.
Can you describe what 1-step sparring is in like the Taekwondo karate context?
Right. So in the 1-step sparring is basically one exchange of a punch or a kick. And so some person initiates, the one party initiates like a punch or a kick, and the second party will respond with one or two techniques. And those techniques can come in multiple steps. So how many steps you move is usually whether it's 1, 2, or 3 steps. But most people just do like more of like a one step. And it goes in an agreed upon sequence. So it's scripted. And the techniques are not done with a technique that looks like what you would find in the sport aspect of it, like sport karate or sport taekwondo. It's done from the formal standard of what a technique looks like, which is more like kata or pumse.
Yeah. So it's basically like, I'm going to throw a front kick. I know I'm going to throw a front kick. I'm going to throw a front kick. You're going to use a specific block and respond with.
Yep. A specific block and a punch probably would be a real basic 1-step. Yeah.
So it's a scripted, it's choreography basically.
Yeah. But you could cheat. You could cheat in this is why that's why I'm working through this, because my worry is knowing my people, knowing the Taekwondo and karate community. When you give them something like random practice, you can't, this sounds bad, but you can't trust them to actually do random practice. You can trust them to do random 1-steps. Somebody might do a genuinely random practice, and another person will do randomized 1-steps, and that'll be their version of random practice. And I know that inclination exists in my community, which is why it might appear painstaking to other people or bizarre to other people, why I tend to be like being careful when I talk about random practice, that for martial arts, we have more things to worry about to make it representative, which is another term, than simply the fact that it's in a random order or in a random sequence.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, I'm kind of thinking about the discreteness aspect, right? So I think there's a scale of that, like, and there's this idea of a free flow sport, like soccer in general is more free flow than football, and baseball is maybe the least free flow. of those, right? So the average sort of pitch is the pitcher throws and then the batter takes, right? And
Right.
it's like the ball was thrown and somebody caught it, right? And then the batter swings some of the time, and a lot of times that's fouled off, right? But unless the ball is put in play, there's just generally just, it's has a very clear beginning and end. Once it goes into play, then you have random, you have the random element.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a clear end to that play when the batter either is safe on base or is put out.
Mm-hmm.
And then in football, you have when does the athlete down, right? And so that creates a discreteness to each play, which makes it more like a kind of like a one step or like a point sparring.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas say wrestling's a little weird because you can collect points and there's a lot of like little random reshoots, but something like, submission grappling is essentially pure free flow, like even more free flow than soccer, which has penalty kicks, which is a set play. So there's an important access of kind of understanding different practice. I also think, like, I've been thinking about this recently. We, in my context, we work with a lot of students who have no martial arts background, who may even be very intimidated by martial arts.
Right.
So how do we introduce this in a way that's going to be really friendly and allow them to experience it and right away get into aliveness? Because I'm not interested in trying to teach a lot of super technical information to people who might not even invest in this. And, kind of our expertise is in play anyways. It's like, if they want super good technique, it's like, go see John Danaher or Dwayne Ludwig or somebody like this, right? And one thing we've been playing with is that actually we're starting to think that that a weapon is the best way to start learning to strike, like a foam sword. And one of the reasons is because it's actually easier to study the dynamics of an interaction, because the length of a beat of action is longer. Right? The time it takes for you to advance into measure and strike and retreat out of measure is much longer. And it is inherently more potentially discrete, especially if you respect the idea of when you're punching, right, and grappling with somebody, you'll sometimes take a punch in order to receive a punch or to give a punch, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can't really do that with a live sword in an unarmed combat situation. Like, you're not going to be like, okay, yeah, he chopped off my arm, but I killed him. It's all good.
Yeah.
Right?
Even with a foam sword, it doesn't hurt, but the feedback is unpleasant enough. There's a psychological that you don't want to get hit. Right?
Yeah. So you get a different dynamic around that, but it lends itself to a little bit more discreteness. One of the things that we think is actually problematic in kickboxing sparring is people become too discreet in the sparring context. They land and then retreat because you don't actually want to hurt your friend. So once you've landed a strike that would be effective in a self-defense situation, your automatic reaction is to flip from antagonistic to cooperative and make sure that your friend is safe, which is important, but we're actually conditioning the wrong kind of response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a problem I've had ongoing with Taekwondo sparring and point karate, which I like. It's not representative of Olympic Taekwondo, which is what I teach, but I like sport karate because that's where I started with Taekwondo, that we did the same rule set, and it's great, really great for anyone, but especially great for kids because it's light contact and you're trying to move in and get that shot really quick, and then if you get the point, you reset and you do it again, right? Mm-hmm. And that could be random. That could be definitely random. And it's definitely variable. But the problem is exactly as you said it, that incentivizes, and I guess this is naturally emergent anyways, but really internalizes this idea of once you've scored the point, that's it. Whereas in Olympic Taekwondo, you're going to give up. You're going to give up points because it's continuous.
Yeah.
And if you don't continue to follow up, you could forfeit. You could have scored 3 or 4 points potentially. You could have won the match on placing someone in that position and capitalizing on it.
So karate has the 1 hit, 1 kill rule, right? Like,
yeah.
Is that specific to Shotokan where they really talk about that, or is that a more general thing?
I believe it started in Okinawa.
Okay.
There's I'm trying to remember the Japanese phrase. I don't remember the Japanese phrase, but there's a phrase for 1 hit, 1 kill that they used to use. I don't know if it's actually literal.
Yeah.
But it's come to be understood that way.
Yeah. So in any event, that's the correct attitude for a sword fight, right?
Right.
Like in a sword fight, your first task is don't get disabled, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't if you're unarmed and you have live blades, unarmored, then like one good hit is going to end the fight generally.
Yeah. So that's an interesting, this is how Kendo has an influence on Shotokan in a way that Judo doesn't, because sparring in Okinawa before sport karate emerges in Japan, and Okinawa, they began to adopt those rules as well, but guys would put on Bogu armor, which is the armor that Kendo and even before Kendo, anyone training in Kenjutsu, sword martial arts, would wear to sparring. They would just put that stuff on, and you see Miyagi puts on the big mitts and the umpires thing. That's kind of reminiscent of that. In the Karate Kid show, they would put that on and they would hit each other hard, and that was more continuous in nature. And then you get sport karate, and sport karate is Gichin Funakoshi is highly influenced by the pedagogy of Jigoro Kano, but he's also he's not the one who created everything about Shotokan. His son, I believe his first name was Gijo or Gigo or something like that, and his one of his star students who wrote the best karate book series I have on my, I'm trying to remember his name. What is his name? I can see it from here. Nakayama. Nakayama. They're the ones that actually really built out what Shotokan looks like today, and they're the ones that really fleshed out the really smooth looking JKA, Japan Karate Association, sport karate sparring of the 60s and 70s. And they were influenced by the Kendo, where you can have exchanges, but as soon as a point is scored, you reset and go to another trial
like this and step
right. Right. You have to get that contact, and then if they fall down, you have to go like you punched them on the ground. You don't even have to be close to them. You just have to do the motion. But Kendo, it's funny because the actual sword fighting sport influenced that discrete style of sparring with sport karate. That's kind of how that comes to being.
So this is kind of the other, like we sort of got ahead of ourselves in talking kind of deeply about the ecological dynamics and that understanding of how we really structure practice. But the other aspect of this that I really wanted to get into with you was the history of the martial arts, because I guess we're operating in the post UFC era, and I feel like the lesson of the UFC is still, it's still making waves throughout the martial arts community, and it's still not fully understood. And I think you would agree with me that like jiu-jitsu revolutionized martial arts, but it doesn't fully understand exactly the thing that made it successful even.
Yeah, I would say it exactly in those terms. They know that they're better, but they don't understand why.
So, and I think that, one of the things that came up in our conversation was that we both think that traditional pedagogies in martial arts are not particularly effective motor learning strategies. And we also both think that they're also not particularly traditional.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
So just for a second, I would love to hear you describe what you see as the kind of broad description of traditional, right? Like when someone compares modern combat martial arts sport to traditional, what is it that they're saying when they mean traditional? Like what is that? What is that? And then we'll get into like how that came to be.
Yeah. So the traditional martial arts program, as most people understand it, as most people practice, especially in the USA, this is I dare to say, somebody might check me on this eventually. I want to say it's modernistic.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Like in the philosophical sense, it is a mass industrial military-esque method of producing carbon copy athletes or learners, whatever. And the view is predicated on a view of physical education that is at least 200 years old. It's almost pre-motor learning literature. I think motor learning becomes a discipline of its own in the late 1800s.
Yeah. Well, let me reflect back to you what I'm hearing and kind of the way I think it. I think you know more details about this, but I want to, as I kind of see it. So when you say modernist, like what does modernist mean? Like modernism is, say, the Enlightenment philosophy of rationality that arises, in some sense with industrialization.
Yeah.
So you have a rejection of a sort of supernaturally infused worldview, and you have the rise of a world that is more and more influenced by our conceptualization of machines. Right. Mm-hmm. We have all this power through the development of machines, through steam power and clockwork. Yeah. And we can see how you can put mechanisms together. Mm-hmm. And we start then believing in this sort of like, essentially like everything is these almost mechanical causal relationships.
Yeah.
And then there's this effort in many different places to modernize things, to make them rational. Right. Rational, if we go back to the Greek words of it, is like to divide it up into pieces, right? To ratio it.
Right.
And I would love to do more research on this, but I think a lot of physical practice really specifically comes out of the German gymnastics and Swedish gymnastics traditions. And those are really attempts to rationalize the approach to the cultivation of the human body so that it's like a factory production. Mm-hmm. So then Jan and these guys, and that goes down, and there's counter movements in some sense. Like if you look at Georges Hebert and Méthode Naturelle, like there's this idea that you don't actually have to use a super rational approach in order to create a great athlete. They happen naturally in these environments where they have nature. And so you have this sort of naturalism that comes back in with Hebert. But if you look at Hebert, he has everyone doing Swedish gymnastics too, right? And so if you look at that and all, Swedish gymnastics is like, it's like aerobics, right? It's like everybody stands in a line and moves their arms in specific ways and their legs in specific ways to explore all the ranges of motion. So my understanding is essentially, when the West basically colonizes Asia, there's a prestige to scientism and a prestige to industrialization that impacts the way that then pedagogy is rationalized and modernized. And that's Jigoro Kano and Gishin Funakoshi. And this is where I don't have as many details as you, but I'm curious if that all accords with your understanding, and if you can give me some more details on how you see that process playing out in Japan.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
also China. Yeah, and Korea too.
China. Yeah. Okay,
well, let's start with Japan.
Korea's fun. With Japan, with Jigoro Kano, he was educated in a Western institution for some time. I don't remember which one it was. He was a fan of John Dewey.
Okay.
Who created the not created, but really his thoughts are the basis of what we now consider the modern public school. So not everything about Dewey is actually bad. He wanted to build a pedagogy around problem solving, but that's problem solving within an industrial sort of process. And so Jigoro Kano is actually not the only Japanese person that was big on that. So this was imported into the school system in Japan. There are pictures of Dewey, with friends and acquaintances in Japan, all over. And so there is that influence that trickles down into these structured physical education programs integrated into schools, right? This is a program that's already big in America that they're pushing for, and that's been happening with physical culture in the United Kingdom. So Japan wants to culture a spirit of its own in its children through these physical education programs in institutions. And John Dewey definitely, and those that line of thinking definitely has an influence on the pedagogy of Kodokan, which in turn was a titan in influencing the other combat sports, especially sport karate, and even more broadly, just the whole traditional karate and taekwondo program. I do think you find people lined up and practice that kind of stuff. You do find that stuff in military in Asia before any sort of quote unquote colonization, I would call it cross pollination, but before the West comes in and really pollinates the pedagogical landscape, you do still find that, just because that's kind of how things work with the military. You have a lot of people, and you're trying to teach them moves before they can do war games and things like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it very much changes in the military context, because you actually coordination of motion across multiple people is very important in a military context.
Right.
The traditional, if you're a British soldier in the Revolutionary War, Crimean War, like you need to fire when you're told to fire, you need to load when you're told to load, you need to do it in sync with everybody else in the line, right? You need to charge when you're told to charge.
Yep.
It's not as much about individual problem solving,
right?
More about the power of coordinated action. So like Steve Morris, I think I've mentioned to you as somebody who I really appreciate. And he often puts up these posts of like, a bunch of people doing Wushu in a park. And he's like, oh, these people are all brainwashed. And maybe they are to some degree, but I think he doesn't recognize the historical roots of that if you want to move a block of 100 men around in a battlefield and not expose your flanks, or get disorganized, that being able to do some kind of complex choreography together that's relevant to battle is super important. So there is some difference in that context.
There's a disparity that with the people doing Wushu together in a park is a little bit. It could be, I don't have mastery of Chinese martial arts history. It could be a little bit anachronistic in the terms of with Wushu being brought back as a reconstruction effort after communist China basically almost decimated Chinese culture, and authentic Kung Fu is almost destroyed at that point. You know, there's always been that element in military training. We have manuals. I have one up on the, of that Korea. It's an ancient Korean manual that they just stole from China, right? Because but that's always been like, there was a disparity between the way the military practice and the way individual civilian martial arts practice worked, whereas civilian practice was much smaller in scale and much more individualized.
Yeah.
And so maybe bigger schools worked more like the military, but there's a lot of schools, there's talks of the way Ip Man, Bruce Lee's teacher, the way his little school used to be, where it worked more like a boxing gym where you had just people in and out all day.
Yeah.
Working as they came and went, and with what was available, a partner, the dummy, other material, push hands if somebody was available, or sticky hands or whatever. It seemed that, at least in many places, that's how civilian martial arts instruction worked, as opposed to martial arts instruction from the military context is going to be much more like how we consider traditional martial arts today to be, with everyone lined up, doing things in a row, 1 2 1 2.
I imagine it's also very different if you're looking at, you have, so like if you go back, I think it's true in Japan and Europe very similarly. You have the samurai class and you have the knightly class. And they're expected to be warriors in a very, very kind of complete sense, where they're training for, if you read my understanding of the knightly manuals, right, they were learning acrobatics, they were wrestling all the time, they were boxing, they were jousting, they were doing all this stuff. They won prestige not only from fighting in battlefields, but fighting in tournament melees and in jousts. So they like had a sport element basically to their comp that was happening throughout. So you had this knightly class, and then if you're like in, I think something like maybe 13th century, 12th century Europe, below that you basically have civilian levies who you throw some weapons in their hand and you give them a little bit of training, and it kind of you hope
there's different levels of military.
And there's a middle class of people who can like afford some civilian martial arts training, and there's traditions of boxing and stick fighting and all that are happening, where people can go and learn the basics. But it's not until the later Middle Ages that you start getting these massed pike formations, where you have professional soldiers who are not elites in society. And so you have a kind of I imagine that the military education of a knight is much more sort of individualized and much more about having a really diverse set of skills, whereas a pikeman is really about performing well in a unit. I think it's probably, I think like if you look at like the American military now, I think it's moving much more towards like a knightly thing, right? But like we utilize special forces so much more. We don't have like massed infantry as a regular part of our military engagement nearly as much, but something like infantry, artillery, and I'm way outside of my scope here now. So if anyone is super military and thinks I fucked it up, let me know. But my understanding of Navy SEALs training, or like special forces training, is that it's very, very different from the traditional military models. Like, it turns out to work for those people, and their adaptability is much more like what we'd be looking for in the athletes we'd want to train, or like an elite team sport athlete, rather than this kind of cookie cutter battlefront type of situation.
Yeah, that's my understanding. I think it's kind of worked. That's an emergent aspect of society's, a societal constraint on working on a military training constraint, where the predecessors of the knights would be the Roman equites, and there's just almost everywhere around the world, regardless of interaction between societies, you have cavalry units being the special forces of the ancient world. Whether they specialize, with the Mongols, like with mobile archery, which is revolutionary at the time. Or you have people who are trained to wield swords and pole arms, and also they know how to shoot, a bow.
Yeah, basically on horses you've got, before there were I think horse archery goes back to at least the Scythians, but I think the Mongols basically perfected it.
Yeah,
but if you look,
they have a special type of bow they built that was maneuverable, and yeah.
I think if you go back to like the early Roman Empire armies, or like Hannibal's armies, you had like the Numidians, who were light cavalry that I think threw javelins. So they would throw light darts and maybe have a sheath full of them, or maybe they rearmed regularly. But you had this kind of light projectile based attack, probably even going back further than that. Like cavalry or like chariots were probably mostly projectile attacks. Or they existed to get you there and let you dismount and fight hand to hand. And then you had lancers, right? So that's you're going to carry a big spear and smash people with it. And then you had people who fought with swords on that, and that's actually the part that I understand the least. Like, what's the advantage? Like, why would you want the reach disadvantage of a sword? I guess once you're working with like mostly armored troops in the late Middle Ages, then the warhammers and the halberds and like all the axes become more important, because you can't armor without a lot more force.
I think when most of a battle is going to be fought with foot soldiers, and when you're locked in, your maneuverability is limited, even though you're lightly armored. That you can't. I wouldn't underestimate the importance of a short sword or something in that situation, because once you've clashed, it's going to be difficult to actually lethally use a pole arm, because you need the space.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the Romans famously relied on their swords, right? Their short sword, gladius. But like the Macedonians, who just conquered everybody else, used the longest spears anybody had used, right? Like that was the advantage of Philip's.
I think that's a broader discussion on tactics, because the Romans had established tactics with their shields, and where they would create these bottlenecks that drove people into and then they would get you with the.
I also think
the shield
armor discussion. I think that the level of armor has a huge degree to play in it. It's like I don't do a lot of this, but I do pay attention to some of the HEMA stuff, and it's like, if you have an unarmed guy versus an unarmed guy, and one of them has a spear, and they don't have shields, and one has a sword, the shield will the spear just slaughters the swordsman, right? It's so much faster to wield it with two hands, and with the maneuverability of like having that whole butt of the spear, plus you have the reach, and it's just fast, and it threatens a huge radius. Whereas once you add a shield, though, the reach advantage is massively reduced. And it's the same thing once you go to full armor, right? Like, you can't really offend somebody in full armor with a long sword by hitting them with the end of the sword. You have to wrestle them with the sword half sworded in order to like poke it into a gap.
Right. And then that's getting into the night warfare.
So I imagine that like the way that you use cavalry also changes as the production of high quality armor goes up, right? So if you have an army of foot soldiers who are mostly armed in gambeson, which is fabric, right? That's going to change what's going to be optimal versus 200 years later, they almost all have at least half armor on, right? They've got breastplate and helmets and the top of their body armor. So I don't know, that's we're super far afield. I love to talk about this stuff, but let's go back for a second to we were trying to characterize actually what is the traditional frame. So the traditional frame is is this pedagogy that evolves from a modernist perspective, and that comes from this meeting of East and West. And you said Kodokan. Can you tell me what the Kodokan is?
The Kodokan is the institute started by Jigoro Kano to propagate judo. Yeah.
Okay. So
over against the jujitsu,
the traditional
traditional hand-to-hand styles available at that time, which mostly existed within the context of broader ancient martial arts schools that taught everything.
Yeah. I was reading about that recently. I was reading about the idea that the Koryu Jiu-Jitsu is itself kind of an artifact. It's not necessary. It's not very representative of what samurais do, because the period in which that was codified was a very peaceful period in which samurais were mostly administrators.
The Reconstruction, Edo. I think it's Edo or something.
It was kind of like these are kind of like recreational schools for people carrying out their idea of samurai identity more than they were actually training grounds for people who were regularly exposed to war.
Yeah. So so actually I want to clarify that when Shotokan comes to Japan, it Japanizes, and however you say it, it becomes more Japanese rather than Okinawan. And there is an influence through Jigoro Kano's Dewey sort of philosophy on the training methods, but it's not as if there is no cultural precedent for a more industrial view. Not necessarily industrial, but kata is not a karate. It far precedes karate. Yeah. Far. It's not even originally a karate thing. Kata is a Japanese social phenomenon. There's a kata for everything in Japan, and with what Koryu Jiu-Jitsu, the schools and their katas, that is the social. That is their way of preserving those artifacts. And I'm not exactly sure how samurai used to train. I'm sure there was an element of kata because it's a long-standing social phenomenon, but surely it was not as the landscape was when Jigoro Kano realized he needed to change things with the introduction of judo, because one of the things that actually in contradiction to what karate did with their style of sparring, Kano innovated with the introduction of randori, which is not discrete. It's continuous, and it's open-ended, and it's really play-based in a way, because randori is not sparring. It's not hard sparring. It's exploratory sparring in many ways. It's more like play fighting or dog fighting is what Jan Jurjevic would say.
Yeah. So I'm tempted to go deep on the ancient history stuff, but I still want to get at what we're critiquing, right? So
yeah, the identity of it.
Yeah.
I think an established system of what will produce the ideal fighter or the ideal karateka or the ideal jujitsuka, one system that will produce that is repeatable and largely the same, regardless of the person who goes through the system, the machine, the process. Yeah. I think that's the big issue that we're touching on here.
And it's, to me, I get the sense that that traditional martial arts, right, which is really modern martial arts, let's say, modernist martial arts are kind of implicitly have an information processing model of motor control.
Yeah, by default.
Yeah, so they have this idea of rote repetition, building a specific motor skill, and that's what's going to make an athlete effective. I was I have an ongoing debate with one of my students about the role of kata and whether kata is actually important in martial arts. And he quoted another author who was saying that, like, you have to create this motor pathway, right? So that it's accessible when something stressful happens. So you have to repeatedly do the same thing over and over again, so you have access to it.
That's exactly how that doesn't work.
Yeah, I know. I was like, that's precisely what I have a problem.
I think there's a lot of ways in which kata is valuable. It's not that.
Yeah.
If we can divorce kata as some sort of engine, a pedagogical engine for martial arts, I think it would become more valuable in many ways, because there's just off the top of my head, there are some indirect benefits to the amount of internal awareness it can build into you, kinesthetic awareness, and that's a very indirect way in which it can be helpful to you later on in your journey as a martial artist who does dyadic type of fighting, combat sports. And then there's as a competition modality, it's valuable if you want to. It's like with gymnastics, if you want to compete in that's something that interests you, it's valuable in that respect. And then it's valuable as a social practice in the park with people. There's research that I recently read that shows that that even synchronized activities like that, or scripted rather, that are done in synchronicity with other people, is actually increases your social IQ in a way, and it increases the bonds. So there's value to it in ways that are less.
So everything you just described to me is equally descriptive of dance.
Right. And I've said that before in the martial arts community. That's a dirty word to say of kata, and I don't mean it that way. Dance is a magnificent social activity that's ubiquitous, is everywhere, and there's nothing wrong with dance. But to a martial artist, it's to say, and this is more of like an American thing, because in Okinawa, dance and kata are nearly the same thing. Yeah. They're related.
I think they are, right?
But over here, it's, that's silly. That's not serious. It's not, and I don't mean it that way, but people take it that way.
Yeah, there's something very strange about Anglo culture where it's considered not masculine to dance
nowadays, anyways. But I don't know if some generations ago it was necessarily, but it is now.
Yeah, I don't know when that came in, but it seems like it's been a thing for at least American men for quite a while.
American. Yeah, if we're talking about outside of English, because I think like English folk dancing in the 1800s is pretty standard for a man to engage in some sort of formal or folk dance. But nowadays it's not, especially Americans. Yeah, we have our own. And that's kind of how when I was younger, I didn't, I wasn't into dancing, so I never did the dancing thing. And for me, going up through martial arts, it was dirty to say that kata was like dancing. It's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. It's not. So, but now when I say that, I have no prejudice or animus towards it. I have a greater understanding of how dancing works in culture, and of the value, especially social value that brings. It gets you moving too, right? Which is important. But yeah, it's when I say, that it's more like dance as an activity, I don't mean it prejudicially, but traditional martial artists will often take that to be dirty, like a pot shot.
Yeah. No, I don't mean it as a pot shot, though. I think, as you said, I think that the sooner that martial artists abandon the idea that kata is about some kind of direct. I don't think that a martial artist needs to do kata at all, right? Like, I think
you don't have to. No.
That the performance record of American wrestling and American boxing and Muay Thai and Dutch kickboxing, for that matter, they all demonstrate that in the development of a combat athlete, there's no necessity for kata, right? I think there is something interesting about dance actually as an adjunct to combat training. Like I've had this conversation a few times, but like, the story with Israel Adesanya, who's, maybe the best striker in the UFC right now, is that he never trained martial arts until he was 18 years old. He had an extensive background in hip hop dance, walks into an MMA gym and takes a fight a week after his first class.
Yep.
Now he's what he is.
Yeah.
He dances before his performances and he showcases this movement. And, people can check out my conversation with Simon Tacker or Marla Fiskin to go really deep into what dance offers the general movement athlete or the combat athlete. But it is not a necessary component to attuning to that environment.
Yeah.
That specific set of dynamics.
There is no environment there to attune to.
Yeah.
For the purpose of combat sports.
Yeah. The way that I think about dance is actually that it's an attunement to music. It can also be an attunement to a partner. And it's an attunement actually to emotional space. There's an emotional environment that's being invoked in dance. And actually that's what I think the origin of kata is. Like I know that it's controversial but my friend Scott Park Phillips has a book, like Possible Origins, I think, about the idea that the Chinese forms, which precede the Okinawan forms, which precede the Japanese forms in many ways, not all, but like there's this lineage of the Fujian white crane into Okinawa, and then that those forms show up in Japanese karate as well. His claim about the Chinese forms is that they're religious theatrical dances, that they come from invoking specific Taoist spirits, because Kung Fu was, the internal martial arts in particular are basically Taoist practices. They're part of a Taoist ecology of practices. And so you're moving in these very theatrical, exaggerated ways, not because, standing like this is great martial arts stance, but because you're actually invoking a narrative structure that has to do with traditional religious practices. That actually makes a lot more sense to me.
I think it is an extension of religious practices. There's a divide in Chinese martial arts between Taoist and Buddhist martial arts. So Shaolin is Buddhist. The internal martial arts are all Taoist, and so the Wu-Tang or Wudang, the temple of the Wudang temple would be their institute, I guess, that they derive from.
Yeah.
But there's an intricate connection between what we look at now as primarily striking, but back in ancient times, wrestling was integrated with Kung Fu, and so was weapon usage. And there's a lot going on. There's a confluence of things going on. First of all, they're using movements that can be conducive to manipulating, for example, a staff. In Chinese martial arts, the staff and the spear are like the chief weapons. Pole arms are the chief weapons. And you have poses that look like the animals. You have poses that look like throws, like one half of a throw that's just missing the partner, right? And the Chinese throws are these really spectacular movements. If you ever watch Shuaijiao, very different from judo. Judo's more, in many ways, compact in the way that they do the throws. In Chinese throws, they have a different system of throwing. That is, it looks way different. And if you looked at somebody doing it without the partner, it would look ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But it works in the context of competition. So there's a lot going on there where I think that the religious practice is driving it in some ways, but I don't think it's simply a narrative. I think the movements are, they're certainly performative, but there's a fusion of weapons work and wrestling that has been, this is more my thoughts on it, but I'm not the only one that has these thoughts, that has been scrubbed from the forms themselves. And so all you see is the spectacular movements. Certainly not all of China is like that. The Southern styles are famously more sparse and practical.
Yeah. I think I agree. I don't think it's entirely just the religion. I think there's an intersection between all these things, between, how the military and military skills are perceived in society, and the use of weapons, which, I just ran onto this article. I haven't finished it yet, but it's looking at the cross-cultural incidence of how people engage in martial arts, and it finds that it's actually a minority of societies that have a fisticuff system. And in most martial arts, you either arrest, in most societies, it seems like, for agonistic interpersonal combat, where you're kind of settling dominance disputes or settling internal disputes, you wrestle. And then if it's against somebody who you're not going to wrestle with, you're going to get a stick at least, or a rock, or a spear, right? Like, you go in right away with the weapons. There's no, like, as you scale force, you skip past the striking with your hands phase.
You go right to weapons, right?
And I was always surprised. I always thought it was strange, like, growing up as a striking martial artist, that, like, it seemed like Japan didn't really have much in the way of striking before karate. Like, there were strikes in traditional jiu-jitsu, but traditional jiu-jitsu is much more focused on grappling. And, part of the argument for that is that it's not much good to punch somebody who's wearing a helmet and has a sword. Like, your goal is to get the sword out of their hands. But I think that's an interesting finding as well. So I think that the idea that the martial arts were more about wrestling and about weapons from the beginning is an interesting frame for a lot of us who, I think Westerners are really focused on boxing. Like, there's something in our culture that has become very boxing oriented when it thinks about unarmed combat. Yeah,
specifically in the Anglosphere.
Yeah,
and very, very much oriented that way.
There may be a kind of bias that we don't realize that we're bringing to how we conceptualize martial arts.
Yeah, which is, judo, I think, came to America before karate, like, by a short margin. I could be wrong on that, but karate is what exploded.
Yeah.
And that's because we have a boxing culture. Now, we had a wrestling culture too, but it was much smaller. It was not as big in the public eye. And the wrestling culture is much more folk level, much more local. And boxing is, even my grandpa did a little boxing in high school. Like, everybody, that when you talk about who knows how to fight, when you want to learn how to fight in American culture, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, you went to a boxing gym. That's how you learn to fight.
It's interesting, though, because I think there's a class element to that. Boxing is viewed as a gentlemanly art. And it's essentially, I think you can view it as a kind of like sword fighting with your hands.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, gentlemen go from dueling to boxing. But there's always this layer of working class people who are doing catch as catch can, and, breaking joints. And, like, in the American frontier, there was gougers, right? They're wrestlers who specialized in how to get to the point where you could take somebody's eye out. I think it was actually called rough and tumble. Like, that's where.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. Yeah.
That was the sport of the American frontier, of the working class of the American frontier.
Yeah.
That's my understanding. So, yeah. So
there's a funny corollary with that. Not corollary, that's the wrong word, but there's a funny parallel with that with Okinawan karate.
Yeah.
The very clean striking based Shorin Ryu.
Yeah.
Is more upper class at the time where it comes into existence, whereas the Goju Ryu, which is has more grappling in it natively, is lower class, and the conditioning is also famously much more intense. on the body hardening and all that stuff. So that it's a lower class, it's the working class people. They did more of the Goju Ryu stuff, and the upper class people did more of the Shorin Ryu.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, you don't want to get too sweaty.
Right.
Too close to somebody else's body, right? That's the other thing.
Yeah, staying away.
1 second. So back to, categorizing kind of modernist martial arts. We have this sense that it's like, I've thought about this in regards to my own work. It's like, it'd be so much cheaper. It'd be so much easier to make money if I could line 60 people up in a line and have them all do the techniques that I'm teaching. Right. But like creating that opportunity for the individual to really attune to the environment inherently means that I can't handle as many students.
Yep.
So there's something about the commercialization of the martial arts as well that's happening there. And then there's this idea of like creating the perfect punch. Like, the athlete who is going to fight best is the athlete who has the best looking punch. And then the idea that you can understand that at a mechanical level, and you can describe that mechanically. I was watching a famous YouTube personality who's a karate guy teaching an Aikido guy how to punch. And he was cueing him to pack his shoulder down and feel his lat and point his elbow at the ground. Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is all internal cues.
Yep.
And he's learning to structurally punch, but he's not learning he's not really actually even learning to attune to the information from the environment, which would specify whether that punch was landing hard. Like, I mean, fundamentally, when you punch something, there's kind of two things you want. You want it to hit the thing that you're hitting hard, and you want it to not hurt you when you do it.
Right.
And then you want to be able to land it on somebody who's moving and trying to avoid being punched and trying to punch you back. Right. But like, if you're just looking at the mechanics of the punch itself, you want it to actually land hard.
Yep.
Without hurting you. So that's what I see as the kind of the problem of the traditional martial arts is you do a lot of drilling, a lot of these forms that have maybe some impact as a choreography that develops a human being, but don't have a lot of specific martial significance. And there's just so much artificialness to the way that people move, right? Like it's amazing. There's all these footage of like martial arts masters who get to like fight. And then you see like when they're not in contact, they're doing Wing Chun. And then as soon as they're in contact, their arms are just milling around like middle schoolers fighting.
Right. Yep.
So then the UFC happens, and you can see that like some kind of randori, because essentially what BJJ has is what judo had, randori. But then BJJ focuses on Newaza, right, which is the groundwork, as opposed to what's the term? There's the atemi, which is the striking, and then what's the throws?
Is it? I don't know if it's Tewaza. I think Tewaza is the a class of throws. I don't think it's the throwing in general.
Okay, but anyways, so judo builds a rule set, a constraint set to promote throwing, which I actually think is kind of brilliant, because I think people really underestimate how much hitting someone with the ground is a very, very powerful martial system. There's other problems with judo, but I think that actually something has been lost in the value of the throw in the translation to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and in MMA, where the ground is built to protect you against the more damaging aspects of a throw. But then you get to BJJ and they have the ability to get you to the ground, which that's getting lost.
Right.
And then they have the ability to control you when you're on the ground. And they develop that through lots of live sparring. And then you have the entry of American wrestling into this arena, and they're really good at getting people to the ground and holding them on the ground. And they get that all through the live sparring. But as I experience a lot of jiu-jitsu, there's a lot of drilling that is just as kind of rote and unalive as what you have in karate. A lot of times a class, there's kind of like two halves to a class. There's rote drilling, and then there's rolling, and they are often like almost unrelated. And I feel like I get a lot out of one and not much out of the other.
Yeah. If you were to ask somebody, is that training? They'd say, yeah, it's all training. It's all training. But I've noticed, and it's happened in more than one school too, and it's across language divides, because one instructor was Brazilian and the other one was just an American. And you got to put your reps in. You know, you have to put your reps in. Yes. So you get your reps in, and it comes time to do free sparring or free rolling or positional sparring, something that's more open. Usually it's just rolling. And they'll say, okay, now it's time to train.
Yeah.
Whoops. So there's almost like this, there's this cognitive dissonance there where they actually intuitively understand this is the real training. And then before that, all that's just you're dead. We're going through the motions basically. And it's a constant fight to get people to pretend in the doing of the rote repetition to pretend as if they're in a tiny snapshot, like in a Japanese anime where they're in the middle, somebody's in the middle of some awesome move and everything slows down, and then you hear the internal monologue and you get flashbacks, and all of this happens within the span of this one punch that's happening in the anime. It's like that's what you're being asked to do when you do these techniques. Is imagine you're in the real thing, but only within 1 second of it, where you're latching and sinking in the arm bar and leaning back. Right, you're in just this 2-second window of a roll, and so you have to treat it like that real 2 seconds. And you have to treat it, and so everything you do has to be really, tight and with intent and all that kind of stuff. And it's just difficult to maintain that in students, which is why their legs are always, they're not, if you're in the real role, the constraints of the role are what tell your body when you need to tense up on something and when you need to be tighter and stuff like that. And that's not present when you're doing your drills, your reps, as people often call them.
Yeah, I like the idea of the way I think about it is like, you want to explore a kind of constraint space first. So we can say like, I want you to get control of that person's arm, right? Hold that arm and make sure someone can't get out. Right? And then you can isolate it and look at, okay, this is the mechanics, understand this about the mechanics so that you're going to be able to control that better. Right. Yeah. And then you go back, right? And you always want to be integrating, like playing in a way that allows you to see the thing that you need to work on. But always playing at a level where you're not bored and you're not repeating it. Like I was in a class recently and we were just working on jabs, right? It was just like, we're going to spend 15 minutes basically just jabbing, just jabbing a pad, right? And
I'm guilty of that, even as a teacher.
Yeah. And it's like, so I'm working with the partner I'm working with. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to make you deal with me moving away and moving in and strafing side to side. So you have to try and handle these layers of complexity. So it's always, for me, it's always about how do I, like, I want him to, let's improve your jab. Good. Right. Let's get the mechanics better. But you got to keep the types of things, doesn't matter if you can do a perfect jab against a stationary pad, right? Like, you got to be able to recognize like when someone's encroaching your space, when you have space to hit, or how to hit when someone's encroaching your space, how to track somebody down who's retreating from you, right? Or somebody who's moving side to side, how to hit those things. And you want to introduce that at a level that athlete can adapt and adopt a technique that's sufficiently effective, right? And they're not just getting lost in, I was reading an article by Marianne Davies, and she was talking about this idea of snow, right? Like movement solutions that are unrelated to what you're trying to develop, right? There's a point at which things are so chaotic that there's just nothing emerging out of it that's actually going to work for you. So you want to constrain it enough that you're kind of in those bounds. So I don't know. I guess I'm just rambling here on my own. My
concern with over constraining on that front is that there is a context to how you landed a punch, and there's a thing that happens after that, and none of that is represented in scripted sequences or pad work or mitt work or any of that kind of stuff. And you never get practice understanding what an affordance looks like for how and when you can punch. And you never get one thing that I've been thinking about recently is the idea of fight IQ and understanding higher level skills, higher order skills of taking in information that you've gained about somebody's fight behavior through the use of feints and fakes and just trying to work them with jabs and feigning kicks, and just basically only engaging in exchanges to figure out what they're going to do instead of trying to be seriously taking them out before you have enough information that you make a real serious effort. And I was always coached in class, you got to feel them out and, bring in information. And I'd be like, yeah, cool. And I'd go in and I would do just random feints and stuff. And I never gathered the information because I didn't know. You can't tell somebody to gather the information. The only way for them to learn how to do that is to practice so much that they begin to pick up on those patterns. And then as they become more advanced, they rather as they gain more expertise, they in turn exploit that strategy in a more sophisticated way. You can't simulate that by showing somebody your map of all the different contingencies that you've experienced and try to get them to memorize them. You just can't do it.
Yeah. This reminds me of, I've been having a lot of conversations around, and for a long term, I've talked about John Vervaeke's idea of the 4 P's of knowing. There's propositional knowledge, procedural knowledge, perspectival, and participatory knowledge, right? So propositional is sort of like, in boxing in an open stance, right? So southpaw versus orthodox, you are in an advantageous position whenever you have the outside foot position. That's a proposition. Right? Yeah. Procedural would be something like knowing how to respond to the way the other guy moves, right? Or like knowing how to step and get that step. Yeah. And perspectival is like looking at, like knowing all the different cues that will allow you to take that step into the space that'll give you the outside foot position. And there's no amount of verbal instruction that will ever give you that.
Yes. Yeah.
You can't read it in a book. You only can become attuned to the environment of controlling outside foot position by putting rounds in. Yeah.
I think you've touched on a difference between the way traditional martial artists approach learning versus an ecological approach. And that is that they think that because they've come out the end So people with expertise that in turn teach, because they've come out the end with some knowledge about how things work, they believe that they can shortcut their students to their position through knowledge transfer. But learning is not knowledge transfer. Knowledge transfer is like one guiding constraint within what learning is. Learning is an adaptation to representative stress and not knowledge transfer. It just doesn't work that way.
I mean, knowledge transfer is the appropriate type of learning for some situations, right? But what Jordan Peterson in his book Maps of Meaning has this beautiful representation of the origin of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. So all knowledge originates from exploratory behavior, right? Mm-hmm. You try something and then it works or it doesn't work for whatever your goal set is. Mm-hmm. And then above exploratory behavior actually has play, right? You now start adding the variation to the behavior to see like what in that behavior is relevant to what you're doing or what other options you have to achieve the same response, right? And like Jean Piaget was first person to represent the fact that children have procedurally correct knowledge of games before they're able to propositionally represent them.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So then you actually can't, like, when a new thing is being discovered, it's usually not articulable.
Yeah.
It has to be done multiple times before it's then articulated. Right. But then once we have the articulate level, the sort of mistaken idea of teaching is that if I transfer my articulation of the knowledge to you, that you have all the levels that I have. Mm-hmm. And that, like, I think of our culture as a culture that's become addicted to the propositional, right?
Yes.
Like I'm sure that you have fallen down a Wikipedia wormhole at least once in your life, right?
Yeah, many times.
Or a YouTube wormhole, right? Like most of what I was talking about with the history of European martial arts. I mean, in some sense, there's like a lot of that you can only know propositionally because it's not happening right now, right? You can't walk onto a battlefield full of pikemen and medieval knights, right? So our knowledge of it is sort of has been dropped to the lowest resolution of only the proposition.
Yeah.
But that ultimately, of course, derived from people actually experiencing those situations. So as a coach, I think there is a utility to offering guideposts, right? Like verbal information can help an athlete know what to attend to.
Right.
Like, Sean Mishka introduced me to the idea of education of attention, intention, and calibration, right? Mm-hmm. This is fundamentally what we're doing. So when I'm working with an athlete, my experience can help them say, like, okay, attend to this, right? Though that can mislead them too.
It can. Yeah. I've been thinking about that too.
Yeah. Like, so I have if I'm in front of somebody and I'm sparring, I have a specific set of affordances. So I have really good vision, right? So that means that I may actually perceptually attune to that environment and be able to pick up specific information that somebody else might not. Mm-hmm. Like Justin Gaethje apparently doesn't have very good vision, and his fighting style, I think, is very much based on like adapting to a lack of vision, right? Yeah. He's bullying in and getting kinesthetic contact in order to, initiate his striking combos because he doesn't see the athlete that well in front of him. So I could be wrong about this, but I think he actually got LASIK, and he's actually adapted to his new affordances, and now is a more effective fighter because he has those affordances. He was an amazing fighter before he had those affordances.
Yeah.
Still, like if I'm trying to teach someone who doesn't have the same perceptual capacities that I do, and I don't recognize that, the information I tell them to attune to might actually mislead them.
Yeah. It could be idiosyncratic. It could be unique to you.
Yeah. Also, I have very long arms proportionally. So I have the ability to frame and get away from somebody, and then take time to attune perceptually to something they might be doing that an athlete who doesn't have the length advantages that I have might not be able to do. So as a coach, I think we have to take much more seriously the idea that the information we give can actually interrupt the student's acquiring of the information that's relevant to them personally. But we do have some ability to extract principles, which then can guide their search strategy for information that's relevant to them. And we can tell them like what we can help them aim at what they should be trying to achieve. And then we can give them constraint sets to play within that will help them calibrate effort to a specific system that's hopefully relevant to whatever task we're aimed at. Is that all accord with your understanding?
Yeah, it definitely does. Like education of intention, attention, and calibration, like that maps onto the modified Newell's model of learning, right? So those are the stages that you go through as you become a more expert learner or more expert athlete in whatever it is that you're doing. The traditional approach tries to circumvent all of that by trying to instruct you into all of that embodied expertise through propositional transfer, rather than designing practices where you are building into the practice that they are going to be forced to start developing or adapting to the perceptual landscape and to the biomechanical requirements of, you were talking earlier about how I think that's Jesse Enkamp was teaching the punch, right? And that's a very karate way to teach the punch. And there's a lot of biomechanical, ingenuity that goes into some of those methods that really maximizes the way you're able to recruit your muscles to deliver maximal force. But if it's decoupled, all of that falls apart in a dynamic environment. And you almost have to, I use the word relearn. To me, the way I view learning now, I would say you would have to learn the first time around to throw that punch in a way that is conducive to an actual fight, because you didn't learn 3/4 of all the skills you needed to use that punch in a fight. You only learned the biomechanical aspect of it. You didn't learn all the different perceptual and tactical aspects of it.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting because as I was watching, like, it did look like Rokas' punch improved, right? Like his punch looks better on the Makiwara after the cues. Right? Yeah. You can see that he's landing with better structure. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I sometimes am not 100% sure about, if this is getting captured in the ecological constraints approach, the understanding of like, where does that fit in, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes it feels like the way that it's described would indicate that there's almost no space for that kind of attunement, that is mostly just going to be counterproductive. And I don't think that's true. I think there are elements of things that we can propositionally transfer that will really help the athlete with that education. But I think like something like, how do I externalize those cues? If like you've seen some of my conversations with Nick Winkelman, right? Like rather than cueing that I want that lat pulled down, that cue, there's good reason to think that cue is going to disorganize a lot of things about the performance if we're looking for power, right? But something like, have that athlete put their fist on your hand and push into the athlete's hand and have them be aware of where the force is transferring through their body, and can they get into a position that's allowing them to more effectively get the force from their foot through their back into your hand. Mm-hmm. That to me is going to achieve the thing that unkept does achieve to some degree, but I think he achieves it at a cost it's not necessary.
Yeah, it's a Stuart Armstrong. I don't know if it's called this in the literature, but Stuart Armstrong calls that the performance, the performance learning paradox, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's that improvement is actually, it might be a little bit too clickbaity to say it's illusory, but it doesn't persist.
Yeah.
The transfer from one practice to the next is much weaker, sometimes non-existent, compared to learning that emerges from an unstable environment. And so the improvement that you see there probably won't be there if you were to come and to hit the Makiwara 2 days later.
Or more importantly, if you were going to actually try to hit somebody.
And it would totally disappear if you tried to hit somebody. Yeah.
So this is the problem of like what they call the session result versus the learning result, right?
Yeah.
You can there are certain things that will help an athlete move better in a session that seem to be very, very low transfer just from session to session.
Yeah.
There are other things that have higher transfer session to session, but have less visible transfer within a session, which is really a kind of a head scratcher for a coach. Because you're generally going to pay attention to the most visible sign, right?
Yeah.
You're looking for change, and
because that's what you show to the stakeholders, what you show to the parents, what you show to the student. So look, I improved.
Yeah, or just to yourself, right? Like if you're just naively like. Anyone who's going to coaching should have some level of just empiricism, right? Like I'm trying to see that what I do results in a change in behavior that's in the direction that I want. So if you don't have a model for how skill, like for me, it was, I had to build a model basically, and then expose my coaching model to a new environment and have it break in order to see it in a new way. Mm-hmm. Like that's what sort of opened my eyes. And I think like, unless you have some understanding of this motor learning, or maybe like a deep attunement through play and through this, I think there are kind of traps along the road of coaching where some things are going to be obvious as ways to improve that actually aren't going to be optimal. We're kind of local optimists.
Yeah. If that's one thing I could teach to every coach everywhere, especially in the traditional martial arts, it's that you cannot judge improvement based on what you observe online during practice. Yeah. You have to test if it reemerges in later practices. If it does, then real learning has taken place. There is actual development going on. It's not it's not illusory, right? It's not, I'm trying to reach for a different word, but it's not coming. And that's the biggest thing for me and for me, it comes down to it's involved with motivation as well, because I know that when I was on a different model of learning, and I looked at improvements in practice as evidence that improvement was taking place, when I saw a student not perform to that level in the next 2 practices, I thought there was a failing on the student's part. Mm-hmm. I didn't know at the time that I was really failing the student, because that's not true. It's not how human learning works. It's not how the education of attention and all that stuff works. And so I was sabotaging the motivation of my students by making it into an issue of them not trying hard enough, or being lazy, or not working hard enough. You can't measure that based on technical competence, because that stuff is non-linear. It's up and down based on what you're doing in practice. And it's often short-lived. It's and the only things that you can know is after over time, a behavior persists over time that is consistent, where you have, I guess you would maybe call it a metastable range of performance. That is real learning. That is a real gain in skill.
Yeah.
And you have to recognize that there's a lot of reasons why somebody would seem to regress that has nothing to do with being lazy or losing skill or losing knowledge or something like that.
Absolutely. The idea of nonlinear learning is really important for people to recognize, right? That you're going to have periods of rapid change. You're going to have periods of stasis, and you're going to have periods of regression. Sometimes in order to make the next step forward, there's something that has to change that's going to destabilize performance for a period of time.
Yep.
So we've opened a lot of doors, and I feel like there's a lot of things that we could try to finish, and I don't know that we can. But so I think, this is probably a good place to stop for this conversation. I think just that little bit of an idea around, what to pay attention to as a coach. Mm-hmm. Is there anything final kind of summary that you'd like to give on like where combat art coaching needs to go for us to improve as an industry, or for you guys to improve as an industry? I'm kind of in the liminal zone of that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is just because you can come up with a logical rationale for why it is that you do a drill and why that drill will work does not mean that it will work that way. It doesn't mean that's how it works empirically. So just because you are married to an explanation that sounds great does not mean that's how it actually works. So don't be blinded by this infatuation with your own rationality. You need to look at the actual behavior that comes from your students, and find ways to control so that you can understand where you might have biases or where you might be making an attribution error or something like that.
Rationality can be very misleading when it's not tied to empiricism as well.
Yep. Absolutely.
And the right empiricism is really important. Right?
Yeah.
Like knowing what to look at and when to look at it in the development path.
Yeah.
So for folks that are interested, I actually didn't even know until this morning when I was kind of doing some research that you actually have a podcast of your own.
Yes, I finally got onto Rob Gray's podcast and did not plug my podcast. So Combat Learning Podcast is the podcast that I run.
Do you have any other projects the audience know about?
I am reopening to teach Taekwondo in I think January. Okay. And it is going to be an entirely constraints-based approach to sport Taekwondo fighting, with a little bit of kickboxing and boxing kind of sprinkled in there for diversity, but mostly oriented towards Olympic Taekwondo. So it is, at least in the beginning, there's going to be no pumse, no kata, no one steps. It's all going to be constraints-based, play-based training. Okay,
very cool. And where is that?
There's a YouTube channel up now. There's you can go to shockwavetkd.com. There's not really anything there because I'm still setting everything up, but that's where it will be housed once things are in full swing.
And are you going to be teaching online, or do you have a physical location?
So it's going to start as a physical location.
And where's
it's going to be? Yeah. And I'm going to document things online for other people to look at and learn from. I don't know if I'll do an actual training program for people, but if people want to follow it and do their own, like set up training pods and get partners and stuff, that's awesome. But it's going to be mostly open source, constraints led approach to Taekwondo that anyone can copy and use.
Where in the world is your school going to be? So people can
Matthews, North Carolina.
Okay, Matthews, North Carolina. So if you're in North Carolina, in that area, then you know where to find the school. So Josh, it's a pleasure. Really enjoyed our chat, and look forward to future chats.
Yeah, pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me on.
Awesome. Hey, you've reached the end of another Evolve, Move, Play podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, if you want to be involved in the conversation, please consider joining us in our new membership subscription so you can get access to question and answers with our live speakers once a month, question and answers with me once a month, and a dedicated forum to discuss everything going on in the podcast, as well as a general discussion of movement on our general movement forums. If you're interested in that, make sure to check out the link below, get signed up, and join a part of our membership community. If you can't join our membership community right now, it's still always helpful if you can like, share, and subscribe, and even hit that bell and get notifications for upcoming Evolve, Move, Play podcasts. But adios for now, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.